Dear forum members, welcome back from break. The first session will be around barriers for key populations to access comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights services. And I'm happy and very glad to introduce Ricardo Walters. He is representing Positive Vibes Trust today, based in Cape Town, South Africa, and he will do the introduction around this topic.
So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a privilege to be able to speak on the topic, and it's a topic that's familiar to us. It's in no way novel, although it's good to see it continued. It really is a privilege to be able to speak to it. Over the last 3 years, Positive Vibes has accompanied communities of LGBT people and sex workers in a process of monitoring and accountability, working with health facilities that provide HIV and other sexual and reproductive health services to share community experience. We've had the privilege to sit with communities and health facilities across Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, Botswana, Uganda, Eswatini, Lesotho. And I'd suggest to us today that the key to overcoming barriers to access that are consistent, that are commonly recurring across countries and across communities, the key to overcoming those barriers lies not so much in programming or education or sensitization. I'd suggest it doesn't rest on awareness raising or persuading some movable middle to adopt more tolerant attitudes through patient social engineering, in some cases referendum. I'd suggest that the path to access is paved by will. In the 10 minutes or so that I have for this input, I could talk from the experiences we've had in communities about local facility encounters, about the experiences of community members at the point of service delivery, the challenges they encounter that are technical or biomedical or clinical or attitudinal. I could speak about often the experiences of withering hostility by healthcare workers and support staff that instill fear and shame and the threat of violence and exposure. I think those can be better addressed by colleagues who will speak at another point in this conference, whose daily work is at the coalface of that response. I prefer to focus instead on the conditions that shape that environment, that enable, that legitimize, that perpetuate, and reinforce it. Let's not pretend, for the sake of rhetoric, as conference attenders, that access is some mystical, abstract quantity, some longed for aspiration that we yearn for in our hearts, but we just can't seem to effect with our hands. As if access is this legendary treasure whose map we've not yet discovered. Access is a code we've cracked. We know what this is about. Access is an issue of disparities. Disparities in social status, disparities in wealth, disparities in class, disparities in power. And we shouldn't pretend in our conversation that the gatekeepers controlling that access are hard-hearted nurses in local clinics. It's too convenient a scapegoat. Instead, I'd suggest that their prejudice, their discrimination, those are symptoms of systemic and structural injustice, and that those things are a vessel, they're a container in which local experiences of stigma and discrimination and denial of access are formed and contained and protected and defended by structuralists, by people who write guidelines for programming, who draft and implement policy and create law. I suggest that access is an attitude. It's not an attitude, it's a structure. It's an environment. Can we as an activist community, presumably proponents of access, can we address a barrier in which we are all complicit? And I'm speaking about language as a barrier to identity. We need to speak plainly, and even in the formulation of the title of this topic, key populations do not face barriers to access. Can we bring ourselves to say the words, to acknowledge the identities? Sex workers experience barriers to access. Gay and bisexual men experience barriers to access. Transgender, gender diverse people experience barriers to access. Teen girls having sex experience barriers to access. Despite sound intentions, key populations, and I've seen just recently how that language is expanding to be key and vulnerable populations, it's become such a suffocating blanket, a coverall. It marginalizes and makes invisible. It erases those whom the state does not deem morally acceptable, who are less decent, so that we don't have to mention them. We don't have to be confronted with our discomfort with them. It's an easy way to erase and ignore and deny the existence of a reality that is not heteronormative and cisgender. And it's an easy way to claim a response to key populations when those include, as we've just recently heard in a facility in Uganda, motorbike drivers, truck drivers, fisher folk. It's a convenient way to deprioritize sexual and gender minorities whose behaviors we would rather not enable. As we accept that language of public policy that erases the otherness of identity, that neutralizes it, is it any wonder that healthcare workers in Zambia, in Botswana, in Uganda, react with shock, with scorn, with surprise, with confusion, aggression, violence, when they're presented with sexual and gender diversity in health facilities? Is it any wonder that LGBT people and sex workers, sexually active teens, cannot access good care from providers who cannot bring themselves to say the word lesbian, to whom lesbians are at best exotic and mysterious, but at worst deviant and pathological? Is it any surprise, for example, that Uganda's national strategic plan to reduce human rights related barriers to HIV, TB, and malaria services, a recent document, 2020 to 2024, developed by the government of Uganda under the Ministries of Health and Justice, fails to mention once gay, lesbian, or transgender identities. Nor does it mention, not once in almost 50 pages of a strategy and prescription for reform, rights-related barriers that are linked to the criminalization of same-sex conduct, sex work, or termination of pregnancy. A structural barrier. We cannot have a conversation about sexual and reproductive health and about barriers to that health without a conversation about rights. Sexual and reproductive health are not just matters of biology, they are fundamental issues of identity. And how do we expect to achieve access for identities that we continue to criminalize through laws that are vestiges of a legacy of oppression from which in so many other ways have fought for our freedom? It's one axis around which African stigma and discrimination revolve. They are the lasting echo of repressive colonialism, whose perverse moralism sought to repress and control and regulate the freedoms of others, including the choices they're made with and for their bodies. If human rights are indivisible, we can't talk about the right to health without talking about the right to dignity. We can't talk about the right to non-discrimination without talking about the right to privacy or to bodily autonomy. How do we imagine free, open, unrestricted access when we can't guarantee freedom of expression in our public facilities as a matter of policy and law? How do we take seriously any conversation about comprehensive health when our public policy and legal statutes routinely deny the fullness of some human identities. Without rights, without all rights, there can be no comprehensive health. That is the delusion of the privileged. To look away from the political in order to find pragmatic local solutions to discrete local problems is irresponsible. I thought I'd share just a little bit how we cannot overcome barriers to comprehensive health. We can't be serious about that conversation when governments, not unlike the government who is the co-host of this conference, talk about combating stigma and discrimination while continuing to criminalize the people they claim to be destigmatizing. When lawmakers passively and actively resist all actions for legislative reform that would remove social and structural barriers, that increases freedom and access for citizens, who they claim are equal in rights and dignity under the law. In Namibia's case, the Land of the Brave proudly claims to uphold the authority, supremacy, and national morality of its constitution. It could effect the repeal of its unconstitutional sodomy law tomorrow. And yet that law remains absent from the official list of obsolete laws identified for legal review. Similarly, the country of Zambia attracts millions of dollars in foreign investment to support key populations at the same time as its president, in a newspaper headline in mid-2019, claimed there are no homos here in Zambia and that he would not inflict gay rights on the people of Zambia. Similarly, we continue around our region to criminalize sex work, despite every indication that criminal laws related to sex work do not reduce demand for sex. Rather, they create an environment of fear and marginalization. And so is it any wonder that in structural environments such as these, that health workers drink downstream from that same source from which stigma flows and feel emboldened by it? Finally, to address access to health limited through stigma and discrimination, we have to shine a light on public policy and programming that support stigmatizing and marginalizing practices and normalize them so that they no longer seem immoral or unethical. I'm talking, for instance, about the indignity of trans women who barely exist in data because they are counted statistically under men who have sex with men. The indignity of lesbian and bisexual women who, even though they are socially marginalized and physically vulnerable, are not considered an epidemiological priority alongside their queer peers, can only benefit from services offered to others in their community by claiming to be sex workers. I'm talking about the almost universal absence of treatment for STIs that are ravaging LGBTIQ people and sex workers, but is not funded through either international or domestic resources. I'm talking about these disturbing conditionalities and incentives for accessing services that, under the thinnest of veils and a public health excuse, amount to coercion. I'd suggest to us today that issues of access are held locked in a structural container that nurtures them. Will, exercised by structuralists with power to act justly at the macro level of the state, is the key to unlock it.